The grand royal court is bathed in the soft, golden glow of hundreds of flickering candles. Their light dances off the gleaming marble floors, casting long shadows that stretch across the opulent hall. The air is thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, heavy and sweet, swirling in delicate clouds around the courtiers who gather in hushed conversation. The polished walls reflect the majesty of the monarchy, a kingdom built on power, wealth, and the illusion of perfection. As you stand in the midst of this beauty, the weight of its history presses down on you. You can hear the soft murmur of noble voices, a symphony of political whispers that mix with the low hum of courtly intrigue. The clinking of golden chalices, the rustle of silken gowns. These sounds, at once graceful and haunting, fill the air. And yet, beneath the surface, there is something darker, something you cannot quite place. A strange chill lingers, an unspoken tension that curls like smoke in the corners of this elegant court. It is here, in this palace of splendor, that the perfect illusion of peace and order is carefully crafted. The queen, draped in jewels and fine silks, smiles as though she holds the world in her hands. She sits beside the king, her face the picture of grace, her voice a soft melody that flows through the halls like a river of calm. But beneath this facade, a far more sinister reality simmers, one that only a select few can see. The queen's ambition, her thirst for power, burns with a quiet fury that no one dares to confront. As you stand in the court, you feel it, a shiver that runs down your spine. The beauty, the luxury, the wealth, it's all a mask, and behind it, something much darker waits to be revealed. The queen's deadly thirst for control, the lengths she would go to for absolute power, will soon come to light. But what lies beneath the surface? The truth is far darker than anyone could have imagined, a truth that would shock the world. The queen, born into a noble family with strong ties to the royal court, rose to power at a time when the monarchy was both revered and vulnerable. Her marriage to the king, a strategic union meant to solidify power, marked the beginning of her ascent to the throne. But this was not a time of peace. The kingdom was gripped by political uncertainty. Rival factions within the court, ambitious noble families, and external enemies all vied her control. The king, though powerful, was weakened by years of poor decisions and a fragile hold on his throne. The political landscape was rife with tension. Wars had drained the kingdom's resources, and the economy teetered on the brink of collapse. Even more dangerous was the constant threat of betrayal from within the royal family itself. The queen, once seen as the king's loving partner, now stood at the heart of a web of courtly intrigue. She navigated this maze of power struggles with sharp intelligence and a growing desire for control, all while maintaining the image of the perfect, dutiful wife. Her ambition, once tempered by loyalty to her husband, began to turn darker. The survival of the monarchy, and more importantly, her own place within it, became the queen's sole focus. Every decision, every move she made was calculated not just to protect the throne, but to expand her own power. This story matters because it exposes the hidden truths behind a royal facade, revealing how power corrupts even the most sacred bonds. The stakes were high. The throne, the future of the dynasty, and the queen's personal ambition were all on the line. The queen was everything the people desired, graceful, regal, and endlessly adored. Her public image was that of a benevolent ruler, a loving wife, and a devoted mother. Dressed in flowing gowns of the finest silks, adorned with jewels that glinted like stars, she stood as the epitome of monarchy. She smiled from balconies, waved to her subjects, and graced every royal function with warmth and poise. To the outside world, she was the perfect queen, powerful yet compassionate, wise yet humble. But behind the carefully crafted facade, a far more complex reality was beginning to emerge. In private,
The queen's heart was filled not with benevolence, but with an insatiable hunger for power. The adoration of her people was a mask, one she wore not out of affection, but necessity. Beneath her polished exterior, insecurity gnawed at her. She feared losing the throne, losing control, losing the very power that defined her. The queen's jealousy festered in the shadows, aimed not only at those who posed a direct threat, but at those who seemed to possess the things she most coveted: the love of her people, the affection of her husband, and the loyalty of her court. Her relationships with her family were far from ideal. Tension simmered with her children, particularly her eldest son, the heir to the throne. His growing independence and the affection he garnered from the people became a quiet threat to her reign. The queen could not allow anyone to overshadow her, especially not her own flesh and blood. While the court saw her children as the future of the dynasty, she saw them as a vulnerability in her perfect image, an imperfection that could, if left unchecked, shatter her carefully built empire. As the queen's obsession with control deepened, her interactions with those closest to her became colder. She distanced herself from her advisors, her family, and even her husband. Her need for power began to eclipse all other relationships, and those who once adored her were now mere pawns in her pursuit of dominance. Despite the outward perfection, something was amiss. Her loneliness, her isolation, and her growing ruthlessness were evident to those who paid close attention, even if they dared not speak of it.
The winds of change had been blowing for months, but it was one event, a single moment, that would ignite the fuse of disaster. It came unexpectedly, a political crisis that shook the very foundation of the queen's carefully constructed reign. A foreign power, previously a reluctant ally, had suddenly turned hostile, and the kingdom was at the brink of war. To make matters worse, a faction within the court, led by a trusted advisor, began to whisper that the king was no longer capable of making the hard decisions needed to secure the future of the realm. The advisor, once a confidant of the queen, now hinted at the possibility of a new ruler, someone stronger, more decisive. The seeds of doubt were sown. This was the moment the queen realized that she was no longer in control. Fear coursed through her veins as the pressure of the political landscape grew unbearable. Her kingdom was on the verge of collapse, and she feared that, in the chaos, her hold on power would slip away. The nagging voice of insecurity, the same voice that had haunted her since the days of her marriage, grew louder, telling her that her rule was precarious. And yet, it wasn't the political crisis alone that pushed her over the edge. It was something far more personal. The relationship with her children, once a source of pride, had begun to shift. Her eldest son, already capable and admired by the court, was growing into a man who might one day challenge her authority. The people, who had once adored her, now looked to him as the future of the monarchy. The queen, whose every move had been calculated to maintain her power, saw in her children a threat, a vulnerability she could no longer afford. The very future she had envisioned for them, as heirs to the throne, now felt like an impending trap. They were not merely her children, they were rivals, competitors for the same crown she fought so desperately to secure. This realization was the catalyst, the breaking point. The queen could no longer afford the luxury of loyalty or affection. Her fears, her insecurities, and her ambition collided in a moment of profound desperation. The woman who had once been a dutiful wife and mother was now consumed with a singular, terrifying thought. To secure her reign, she would have to do whatever it took, and if that meant betraying her own blood, so be it. As the political crisis intensified and her relationships fractured, the queen's mind began to warp under the weight of her fears. The betrayal of her trusted advisor, combined with the looming threat from her own children, pushed her into a corner. She could feel the walls closing in, and in that space of claustrophobic dread, a chilling clarity emerged. She would stop at nothing to retain her power, even if it meant severing the last ties of affection she had ever known.
Her mental state became increasingly fragile as the days passed. Paranoia took root. She saw betrayal everywhere, in the eyes of her courtiers, in the whispers behind closed doors, in the sudden silence from those who once admired her. She felt isolated, even surrounded by people. The queen, a woman of great intelligence and beauty, was now a woman consumed by fear, insecurity, and the desperate desire to control her fate. As the queen's power began to solidify, so too did the corruption that accompanied it. What had once been a crown she wore with grace and duty was now a weight that consumed her every waking thought. Her every move, every decision was calculated with one purpose in mind: survival. She rationalized her actions, telling herself they were necessary to preserve the monarchy and the stability of the realm. The people depended on her. She was the guardian of the kingdom, and nothing, not even morality, would stand in her way. The first subtle betrayals came with small, seemingly insignificant acts: whispers to courtiers, a nudge to those who could shift the political tides in her favor. She began to sow doubt in the minds of her allies, making them question each other, making them unsure of whom to trust. The whispers grew louder. Was it an accident when the king's most loyal advisor was suddenly implicated in treason? Was it mere coincidence that a noble with too much influence suddenly fell ill, never to rise again? At first, these actions seemed harmless, even necessary, small sacrifices for the greater good. But with each manipulation, each calculated betrayal, the queen grew more accustomed to playing this dangerous game. The line between what was justifiable and what was morally bankrupt blurred more and more. She told herself that the ends justified the means. The kingdom needed her, the throne needed her. But as her power grew, so too did her cruelty. The once gentle queen who had loved her people and her family now betrayed those closest to her without hesitation or remorse. She turned on her advisors, planting seeds of distrust, eliminating threats by any means available. Those who once served her out of loyalty were now expendable pawns in her quest for dominance. She no longer hesitated to manipulate, deceive, or destroy anyone who stood between her and her goal. The toll this took on her humanity was profound. At first, there was a flicker of guilt, an echo of the woman she once was, but this guilt, this pang of conscience, soon faded into nothingness. It was replaced by something far colder, something much more dangerous: an indifference to the suffering she caused. She no longer saw the people she betrayed as human beings, but as obstacles, obstacles to her ultimate power. The queen's cruelty became more calculated, more ruthless. She began to view everyone in her court through a lens of fear and suspicion. The only true loyalty she trusted was her own. Her relationships with her family, which were once her greatest joy, began to crumble. She could no longer trust her husband, who was becoming increasingly weak and detached from the political machinations around him. She began to see her children not as heirs, but as potential threats, rivals to be crushed beneath her iron grip. The growing numbness to the pain she inflicted was perhaps the most chilling sign of her descent. What had once been difficult to justify was now an integral part of her reign. She was no longer the queen who loved her people. She was a ruler whose power came at the cost of everything else.
The queen's descent into darkness reached its horrifying apex with her first true act of betrayal, the murder of her own flesh and blood. Her eldest son, once the pride of her heart, had become her greatest threat. His growing influence among the court, his rising popularity with the people, and his obvious capability as a leader made him a rival in her eyes, a challenge she could no longer afford. His claim to the throne loomed ever closer, and the queen could not allow the fragile stability she had worked so hard to build to be taken from her. The methods she chose were chilling in their precision, a reflection of the depths to which she had fallen. The queen had never been one for overt displays of violence. No, her mind was far more calculating. It was a slow poison,
laced in the sweet wine her son so often drank after a long day. She watched him every evening as he sipped from the goblet, oblivious to the toxic brew that coursed through his veins. It was subtle, methodical. Over time, he grew weaker, his face pale, his movements sluggish. He dismissed it as illness, never suspecting that it was his mother who was slowly poisoning him. And when the inevitable happened, his death, it was presented as a tragic accident, a sudden fever, a tragic fall in his chambers, an untimely death in the night. The queen, standing over his lifeless body, felt a fleeting pang of grief, a tear slipping from her eye as she kissed his forehead. For a moment, she was the woman she had once been, a mother, mourning the loss of her child. But then, like a dark fog, the truth settled in. Her son was dead because of her. She had killed him. The guilt surged, sharp and violent, threatening to swallow her whole. How could she have done this? How could she have turned her back on everything she had once held dear? But the grief was quickly stifled, buried beneath the weight of her ambition. She had done what needed to be done. The crown was secure and her position unchallenged. The monster she had become was justified in her mind. In the silence of her chambers, the queen suppressed the feelings of regret, the sense of loss, until they were nothing more than distant echoes. She could not afford to feel, not now. The throne was hers, and no one, not even her children, could take it from her. The cover-up was flawless. The court mourned, the people wept, and the tragedy of the son's untimely demise was accepted as a natural disaster. The queen manipulated the story with ease, ensuring the whispers of foul play never reached the light of day. She told herself that this was the only way to protect her kingdom, by any means necessary. As the queen's grip on power tightened, the weight of her dark actions became a cold, calculated routine. The murder of her son had been just the beginning. With each passing day, her sense of morality deteriorated further. What had been an act of desperation had evolved into a systematic campaign to eliminate anyone who posed even the slightest threat to her throne. And with each new betrayal, her cruelty grew bolder, more brutal, more precise. The next victim was a trusted advisor who had once served the queen faithfully. His influence in the court had begun to overshadow hers, and his whispers of reform were seen as a challenge to her absolute control. His death was quick, efficient, a poisoned letter delivered to his door. A tragic accident, they would say. Then came the rival noblewoman, whose popularity among the court was rising as she seemed to garner favor with the king. She was found, unexpectedly, in her chambers, a violent confrontation having ended her life. No one could trace it back to the queen, and those who knew better dared not speak of it. With each death, the queen's power grew, and the court's fear of her deepened. No one questioned her, not publicly. Those who might have suspected her treachery were silenced by their own ambition or the palpable terror of retribution. In private, whispers filled the darkened halls of the palace. Was the queen really the benevolent ruler they had once known, or had she become something far darker? Yet, as quickly as the rumors spread, they were quelled by the queen's iron grip on the court. Every victim was carefully spun into a narrative of tragedy, a series of unfortunate accidents, illnesses, or natural deaths. The queen controlled the narrative completely, ensuring that the stories she wished to tell were the ones that were believed. With every act of brutality, the queen's coldness grew. Her once warm, loving nature was replaced by a chilling efficiency. She no longer hesitated when eliminating those who stood in her way. Her cruelty had become a means of survival, a way to ensure her reign would never be questioned again. Her manipulation of those around her deepened. Even the courtiers who had once admired her now moved in fear, aware that loyalty could be as deadly as betrayal. In this court of shadows, everyone was expendable. But it wasn't just the courtiers who were afraid. The queen herself was becoming a prisoner of her own power, caught in a cycle of violence she could no longer escape. Every death, every betrayal took a little more of her soul. Yet her ambition refused to let her pause, let her mourn, let her feel. She had tasted the sweetness of control and would never relinquish it. The queen's reign of terror reached its horrifying climax with an act so unthinkable, so utterly devastating, that it sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Her last remaining child, the young heir who had survived her earlier machinations, was now the only obstacle between her and absolute, unquestioned power. In her twisted mind, the threat of his future rule was too great to ignore. With cold, calculating precision, the queen executed her ultimate betrayal, the murder of her own flesh and blood. The method was deliberate, a cruel blend of violence and deceit. The child, naive and trusting, was lured into a secluded chamber under the pretense of a private audience with his mother. There, in the quiet, the queen's once gentle hands, now hardened by countless acts of cruelty, wrapped around the child's throat. His struggle, desperate and full of innocence, was a sharp contrast to the queen's cold determination. As his breath faltered, her mind remained focused, numb to the pleas of the very blood she had once sworn to protect. The silence that followed was deafening. The heir, the future of her kingdom, was gone, his life snuffed out by the very woman who had brought him into the world. The brutality of the act was unparalleled. It was not just the physical violence that shocked those who later discovered the truth. It was the emotional weight of the queen's betrayal. She had crossed the ultimate line, betraying her own child, the last vestige of love she had ever known, all for the insatiable hunger for power. This was no longer the queen of the people, nor the mother of the kingdom's future. This was a woman consumed by darkness, willing to sacrifice everything, including her own soul, to secure her rule. The aftermath was immediate and catastrophic. The court, already teetering on the edge of fear, erupted in shock and outrage. The news spread like wildfire. Her son was dead, and it was clear that his death was no accident. The people, who had once adored her, now turned their backs on her in horror. The betrayal was so profound, so unimaginable, that even her most loyal supporters could not justify it. The queen's dynasty, once so secure, began to crumble before her eyes. The walls of her kingdom closed in on her as the court turned against her. Her reign of terror, once masked by beauty and grace, was now fully exposed to the world. No one was safe. The queen, in her unrelenting thirst for power, had ensured that her rule would never be remembered with fondness, but with fear and revulsion. What had begun as a pursuit of control had ended in the destruction of everything she held dear.
From a modern psychological perspective, the queen's actions can be traced to several key personality traits and disorders that manifested in her pursuit of power. The most apparent is narcissistic personality disorder, where the queen exhibits an overwhelming need for admiration, a sense of entitlement, and an inability to empathize with others. Initially, her actions were motivated by a desire to protect the throne, but over time they morphed into a relentless drive to ensure that no one, not even her own family, could threaten her position. She needed to feel superior to everyone else, and when threats to her power emerged, whether in the form of her children, advisors, or allies, she responded with ruthless disregard for their lives. There's also a clear thread of sociopathy, or antisocial personality disorder. The queen's ability to commit horrific acts without remorse,
her manipulation of those around her, and her utter disregard for the well-being of others all point to a deep-seated detachment from empathy. She viewed the people in her court, and even her own children, as pawns in her game of power. The concept of right and wrong became irrelevant as long as the end justified the means. This behavior highlights how power corrupts. The queen, once a benevolent ruler, became consumed by the intoxicating feeling of control. At first, her actions were born from fear and insecurity, motivated by the need to protect her family and kingdom. But as she tasted success in eliminating threats, the moral boundaries began to blur. Each successive act of betrayal, each step further into darkness, solidified her sense of invincibility. The queen's initial desire to serve the kingdom transformed into a warped need to dominate it entirely. At the heart of her descent lies a universal truth about human nature, the willingness to betray even the closest loved ones for power. Throughout history, countless individuals have sacrificed family, friends, and even their own integrity for the sake of personal gain. Power, when sought without checks or balances, can warp a person's sense of self, leading them to rationalize heinous actions as a means to an end. The queen's actions weren't simply driven by ambition. They were driven by a deep-seated belief that she was entitled to control, regardless of the cost.
From a modern psychological perspective, the Queen's actions can be traced to several key personality traits and disorders that manifested in her pursuit of power. The most apparent is narcissistic personality disorder, where the Queen exhibits an overwhelming need for admiration, a sense of entitlement, and an inability to empathize with others. Initially, her actions were motivated by a desire to protect the throne, but over time, they morphed into a relentless drive to ensure that no one, not even her own family, could threaten her position. She needed to feel superior to everyone else, and when threats to her power emerged, whether in the form of her children, advisors, or allies, she responded with ruthless disregard for their lives. There's also a clear thread of sociopathy, or antisocial personality disorder. The Queen's ability to commit horrific acts without remorse, her manipulation of those around her, and her utter disregard for the well-being of others all point to a deep-seated detachment from empathy. She viewed the people in her court, and even her own children, as pawns in her game of power. The concept of right and wrong became irrelevant as long as the end justified the means. This behavior highlights how power corrupts. The Queen, once a benevolent ruler, became consumed by the intoxicating feeling of control. At first, her actions were born from fear and insecurity, motivated by the need to protect her family and kingdom. But as she tasted success in eliminating threats, the moral boundaries began to blur. Each successive act of betrayal, each step further into darkness, solidified her sense of invincibility. The Queen's initial desire to serve the kingdom transformed into a warped need to dominate it entirely. At the heart of her descent lies a universal truth about human nature, the willingness to betray even the closest loved ones for power. Throughout history, countless individuals have sacrificed family, friends, and even their own integrity for the sake of personal gain. Power, when sought without checks or balances, can warp a person's sense of self, leading them to rationalize heinous actions as a means to an end. The Queen's actions weren't simply driven by ambition, they were driven by a deep-seated belief that she was entitled to control, regardless of the cost. The Queen's actions, her ruthless pursuit of power, reverberated through history in ways far beyond her reign. The immediate consequences of her bloodshed were felt throughout the monarchy, as her brutal elimination of rivals destabilized the kingdom. With the loss of key figures, advisors, family members, and even trusted allies, the court was plunged into a chaos that undermined its very foundations. The once thriving royal family became a shell of its former self, consumed by fear, suspicion, and a profound sense of betrayal. Her violent purges left the monarchy vulnerable to external threats,
as the kingdom, already weakened by internal strife, was unable to present a united front to its enemies. The queen's actions set off a domino effect, where the political instability she created lingered for generations. Her children's legitimacy was forever questioned, and the royal bloodline, once thought secure, became a tragic symbol of disarray and loss. Her reign, which had begun with such promise, ended up weakening the very dynasty she sought to protect, leaving behind a fractured kingdom. History, as it often does, sought to hide the darker aspects of her reign. The truth about the queen's actions was intentionally obscured or distorted by those who stood to benefit from her power: court historians, loyalists, and even her surviving allies. The brutal reality of her betrayal was downplayed, framed as tragic misfortunes or the natural order of things. The royal legacy was carefully polished, and the true cost of her tyranny was buried in the annals of time, hidden beneath layers of revisionism. As we reflect on the Queen's tragic rise and devastating fall, it is impossible not to draw parallels to modern-day figures who exhibit the same dangerous traits: an unyielding thirst for power, a disregard for human life, and an insatiable desire to control. From political leaders who manipulate, deceive, and eliminate rivals, to figures in the business world who sacrifice integrity and relationships for dominance, history is filled with individuals who have followed a path eerily similar to the Queen's. The desire for absolute control knows no time or place. It transcends eras, societies, and systems. The Queen's story is not just a relic of the past, but a haunting reminder of the power dynamics that continue to shape our world. The true cost of absolute power is staggering. On the surface, it may appear as though the Queen's victory, her unchallenged rule, was a triumph. But in reality, it was a hollow, destructive victory. For the Queen, power came at the expense of her own humanity. She became a prisoner of her own ambition, isolated by the very power she once craved. The emotional and psychological toll it took on her was profound. Her once loving heart had become cold, capable of betraying even her own blood. And as her actions left her dynasty in ruin, the entire kingdom paid the price for her unchecked thirst for control. This story challenges us to examine the dynamics of power in our own lives. How often do we see individuals climb to the top by sacrificing their morals, relationships, and integrity? How often do we turn a blind eye to the abuses of power, dismissing them as necessary for success? The Queen's actions remind us that unchecked ambition can lead to devastation, not just for the individual, but for the society they govern. As you reflect on the Queen's tragic tale, think about the power dynamics that surround you, whether in your personal life, in politics, or in the corporate world. How are power and control influencing the world around you? The story of this queen isn't just history, it's a warning.